The glimmer of the champagne flutes reflected the soft golden light of the chandelier, casting shadows across the elegant dining room. Billionaire Charles Whittaker, the man who had everything, stood poised at the center of it all. He was wealthy, powerful, and admired by many. His life was a carefully curated masterpiece, a mansion, expensive cars, beautiful women. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, something that seemed so innocent would alter everything. As he raised the glass to his lips, preparing to take a sip of the sparkling drink, a tiny voice cut through the air like a sudden gust of wind. "Don't drink that." It was a little black girl, no more than 8 years old, standing at the far side of the room. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, and her tiny hands trembled as she pointed towards the champagne. Everyone turned to look at her, confused, a bit amused. What could this child possibly know about the affairs of the rich and powerful? But the girl wasn't laughing. There was no hint of playfulness in her voice, only a deep, gut-wrenching urgency. Her warning hung in the air like a dark omen, one that would shake the very foundations of Charles's life. "Who's this little girl?" one of the guests murmured, raising an eyebrow. "What's she doing here?" The room buzzed with quiet murmurs, but Charles wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the girl, and for the first time that evening, his confident demeanor faltered. It wasn't that he didn't find her odd, he did. The little girl was a mystery, an outsider in a sea of polished faces. How had she gotten in here? And why was she speaking to him? But her words weren't just words, they were a warning he couldn't ignore. Across the room, sitting in the corner of the room under the dim lighting, was Bianca, Charles's mistress. She was beautiful, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her lips painted a perfect shade of crimson. Her eyes, though, were narrowed in suspicion. She had been the one to introduce the little girl to the party, a curious choice considering the girl seemed completely out of place. Bianca's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile as the drama unfolded before her. Charles stood frozen, the glass still hovering near his mouth, his hand trembling ever so slightly. The other guests had fallen silent. The tension in the room was palpable. The little girl stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't seem afraid of the crowd, not even of the wealthy and powerful people who were now staring at her with bewilderment. "No, don't drink it," she repeated, her voice louder now, more forceful. Her eyes flashed with an intensity that belied her small frame. Charles glanced down at the champagne, then back at her, his heart beginning to race. Was it possible? Could something be wrong with the drink? Or was this some kind of twisted joke? Suddenly, it clicked. The warning wasn't about the drink at all. It was about something far more dangerous, something far more sinister. Charles's eyes darted around the room, searching for the one person who might know more than he did. That was when he saw Bianca. She was standing at the far corner, her gaze fixed on the little girl, her expression unreadable. It was a look Charles had seen before, a look that suggested she knew something he didn't. The chill that ran down Charles's spine wasn't just the air-conditioned breeze. It was the creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just some innocent child with an overactive imagination. Maybe she was the key to unraveling a much darker story, one that had been unfolding behind his back, under his very nose. As the minutes ticked by, the room seemed to close in on him. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the murmurs of the guests, the growing sense of something wrong. The little girl's warning, Bianca's presence, the way everything had seemed to align just a little too perfectly, it was all beginning to make sense. Charles could feel it now, the danger lurking beneath the surface of his perfect life. The mistress he trusted, the woman who had wrapped herself around him with her sweet words and seductive charm, was hiding something. And this little girl, who had appeared out of nowhere, might just hold the key to exposing it all. But what was the plan? And who was behind it? Was Bianca truly as innocent as she appeared, or was there something more to her connection with the little girl? Before Charles could process all of this, the girl spoke again, her voice a low whisper now. "She's going to kill you." A chill ran through his body, and for the first time that evening, Charles felt a real sense of fear. Bianca's eyes flickered with something dark, something that told him she knew exactly what was coming. The room was silent as the last few words echoed in Charles' mind, reverberating in the hollow silence. The girl's warning was clear, and with it, the veil of mystery that had hung over Bianca for so long began to unravel. But what was the sinister plan? What had Bianca been hiding all this time? And why had this little girl chosen now to warn Charles? As Charles stood there, caught between disbelief and growing dread, the night seemed to stretch on forever. The champagne in his hand suddenly felt like a ticking time bomb, the delicate glass an object of looming danger. And the deeper Charles looked into the little girl's eyes, the more certain he became that there was no turning back from the secrets she was about to expose. But just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The door to the room swung open, and another figure entered. This time, it wasn't one of Charles's high society guests. This was someone entirely different, someone who could change everything. Stay tuned. The mystery is only just beginning. The footsteps grew louder as the figure approached, its shadow stretching across the polished floor. Charles's heart raced, his mind spinning, trying to connect the dots between the warning and the strange, almost prophetic little girl. Who was she? And why did she seem so sure of the danger that lurked in the very glass he held in his hand? The new arrival was a tall man, his presence commanding despite his unassuming attire. He wasn't one of the usual partygoers. No, his clothes were practical, simple, but there was something about the way he carried himself that told Charles this wasn't an ordinary guest. His face was sharp, his eyes calculating, and despite the calm demeanor, there was a hard edge to his gaze that immediately put Charles on alert. The man glanced briefly at the little girl, who had yet to take her eyes off Charles before his focus shifted to Bianca. Her expression tightened the moment she saw him, her lips pressing into a thin line, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal that she knew exactly who he was. "Jared," Bianca said quietly, as though saying his name was something she had hoped to avoid. Jared gave her a curt nod, his gaze flicking between Bianca and the growing tension in the room. He wasn't here by accident. That much was clear. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying a certain authority that seemed to quiet the room even before he spoke. Bianca's gaze flickered nervously towards the little girl again, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. "It's nothing," she said, her tone smooth, but tinged with something Charles couldn't quite place. "Just a child being dramatic." Charles wasn't convinced. There was something in her voice, something in the way she tried to downplay the situation that didn't sit right with him. And Jared's sudden appearance wasn't helping matters. The little girl, still standing at the edge of the room, glanced briefly at Jared before her attention returned to Charles. Her voice, soft but insistent, broke the silence once again. "You can't trust her. She's going to hurt you. Please, don't drink it." Charles' mind raced. What was going on? How did this little girl know about Bianca? And why had she come here, of all places, to deliver this cryptic warning? Bianca's eyes locked with his now, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to thicken with tension. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Charles," she began, her voice sweet and measured, as though trying to reassert control over the situation. "Let's not get carried away. You know how children can be, full of imagination." But Charles wasn't so sure. His instincts were screaming at him, telling him that the child was speaking the truth, that there was something far more dangerous at play here than just a misguided warning. He had seen the way Bianca reacted to the girl's presence. The nervous flickers of her eyes, the tightness of her smile, something wasn't adding up. Jared, seemingly sensing the growing unease in the room, took a step forward, placing himself between the little girl and Charles. He was like a wall, solid and unyielding, his presence making it clear he was here to protect Bianca, and whatever it was she was hiding. Charles's grip tightened around the glass. He could feel the weight of it now, the cool condensation against his palm, but somehow it felt different. It wasn't just a drink anymore. It was a symbol of everything that was unraveling in front of him. "You should listen to her," the girl said, her voice quieter now, but still filled with that same unsettling conviction. "She's already made plans. You're just a step in them." Bianca's expression faltered for just a fraction of a second, too brief for anyone to notice, except Charles. And Jared, of course, who was now standing so close to her, he must have seen it too. "Enough of this," Jared said, his voice low and dangerous, cutting through the tension like a blade. "We don't need to entertain this child's fantasies." He turned his attention back to Charles, his eyes narrowing. "You can forget about her. She's not our concern." Charles didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. The little girl had appeared out of nowhere. She seemed to know too much, her warning too specific to be mere coincidence. And now Jared, this mysterious man who didn't belong here, was intervening in a way that felt almost rehearsed, like he was part of something larger. But what? The little girl stepped forward, her tiny hand held out, as though she was offering him something that didn't belong in this world of luxury and secrets. "Please," he whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. She's already planning it. The poison is in your drink." At those words, a shiver ran down Charles's spine. Poison. Was that what she meant? Was it possible? He thought back to the last few minutes, to the time he'd spent with Bianca. The way her smile had seemed so perfect, too perfect. Her laughter, her touches, all of it now seemed to take on a darker meaning. Jared stepped in front of the girl, blocking her view of Charles. "I said enough." Charles finally broke his silence. "What's going on here? What does she mean by poison?" His voice was sharp, edged with disbelief, but also something else, something darker, like a flicker of understanding had begun to form in the back of his mind. Jared didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Bianca, whose eyes had now shifted to a darker shade of blue, her usual calm demeanor replaced by something more calculating, more dangerous. "You should go home, little one," Jared said, his voice turning cold. "There's nothing for you here." But the little girl didn't move. She simply stood her ground, her eyes locked on Charles. "Don't drink it," she repeated, her voice now more of a plea than a command. "She's already made her move." The silence in the room deepened. Charles felt trapped, caught in a web of lies and hidden motives. The party, the wealth, the luxury, it all seemed so meaningless now. All he wanted was to understand what was happening, to uncover the truth buried beneath the facade. But as the moments stretched on, that truth seemed to slip further and further from his grasp, obscured by a veil of deception and fear. And then, just as he was about to say something, anything, a sudden noise broke the tension, the sound of a phone vibrating on the table. The noise was sharp, piercing the silence like a crack of thunder. Charles looked up, his eyes scanning the room. It was Bianca's phone. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing over the screen before she picked it up. Her eyes widened briefly before she quickly composed herself, her face returning to its usual mask of control. "Who is it?" Charles asked, his voice tight. Bianca didn't answer. She simply placed the phone back down, but something in her demeanor had shifted. Whatever was on that screen, whatever message she had received, it had changed everything. And Charles realized, for the first time that evening, that the game had already begun. The phone vibrated again, louder this time, as if the very device was desperate to get her attention. Bianca's fingers twitched, but she didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, she cast a quick, anxious glance toward the little girl, whose gaze remained unwavering on Charles, her tiny frame tense with anticipation. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if everyone was waiting for Bianca's next move. Charles was getting frustrated now. His mind was a mess of questions, and none of them had answers. The little girl's warning was still echoing in his head. "The poison is in your drink." Could it be true? Was Bianca truly capable of something like that? The idea seemed absurd, but the way she had acted, the way Jared had inserted himself into the situation, It all pointed to something darker than he had ever imagined. "Bianca," he said, his voice firm but edged with growing suspicion. "Who's behind this? Who are you working with?" Bianca finally picked up the phone. Her fingers brushed the screen briefly, and her eyes flickered to the message. Whatever she saw made her expression change subtly, just a small shift, but Charles noticed. There was no smile this time, no soft reassurance, just a cool, calculating look that set his nerves on edge. She exhaled slowly, as if preparing herself for something. Then, with an almost imperceptible shrug, she said, "I think it's time for you to leave, Charles. This isn't your place anymore." Charles stiffened. The words hit him harder than he expected, as if they were a blow he hadn't been prepared for. Not your place anymore. What did that even mean? He'd built his empire from the ground up, fought for everything he had, and now she was telling him that it didn't matter. That the life they had shared, the relationship, was all just smoke and mirrors. He felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean, Bianca? What's going on?" But before she could respond, Jared stepped forward, blocking his view of Bianca entirely. "You need to go," Jared said, his voice low and stern, "before things get out of hand." Charles felt a rising tide of anger. Out of hand. He wasn't about to be pushed around by anyone, especially not Jared, this stranger who had just appeared out of nowhere. But he knew there was more to the situation than just a simple power struggle. He could sense it now, the sharp edge of something dangerous just beneath the surface. "Why are you doing this?" Charles asked, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried a weight of desperation. "What do you want?" Jared didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, as if deciding whether or not to speak, his eyes flicking between Charles and Bianca. It was clear there was something he wasn't saying, something that tied him to this mess, something that made him a player in whatever game was unfolding here. Bianca took a step toward Charles, her heels kicking sharply against the floor. She was close now, close enough for him to feel the heat of her breath, her perfume heavy in the air. But there was no softness in her eyes, no warmth, just an icy mask, the kind of look that told him there was nothing left between them. "Listen to me," she said softly, but there was no kindness in her tone. "I warned you. It was always going to end like this." Charles felt his stomach twist. End like this? What did she mean by that? What had he done to deserve this? He searched her face for any sign of the woman he had once known, her smile, her laugh, her touch. But all he saw now was a stranger, a woman who had been playing him, using him. And then there was Jared, the enforcer, the shadow who seemed to be a part of whatever dark plan was unfolding. Charles took a step back, his eyes never leaving Bianca's. "Is this about the money?" he asked, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Is this about something bigger than us? Because I'm not backing down." Bianca's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Oh, it's never been about the money," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "It's always been about control, power. And you, Charles, have always been a pawn in someone else's game." Jared shifted slightly, his posture stiffening as if he had just been handed his cue. He took a step toward Charles, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand yet, but you will," he said. "This isn't about you anymore." The words hung in the air, and Charles felt his heart race. What were they talking about? Who were they working for? He had no idea how deep this went, but it was clear now that he was in way over his head. Before he could respond, the little girl spoke again, her voice soft but urgent. "She's lying," she said, her eyes never leaving Bianca. "She's the one who's been controlling everything. It's all been part of her plan." The room fell into an eerie silence as Bianca's face hardened, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Charles turned toward the girl, his mind spinning. Her plan? What did she mean? Could it be true? Was Bianca the mastermind behind all this? Or was the little girl just another pawn in this elaborate game? Bianca's gaze flicked to the girl, and then to Jared, before settling back on Charles. "You really think she's the one in control here?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. You think she's the one pulling the strings? The girl didn't flinch. She's the one who set it all in motion. The poison, the money, the power. It's all connected. Charles's head was spinning. Poison, money, power. What was she talking about? And why had Bianca gone to such lengths to manipulate him? Jared stepped closer now, almost too close. Enough of this, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You're out of your depth, Charles. You don't know who you're dealing with. The room felt suffocating. Charles could hear the blood rushing in his ears, his mind racing to piece together what was happening. Everything he had built, everything he had trusted, it was all crumbling. Bianca, the woman he had loved, the woman he had thought he knew, she had been playing him from the start. And now the little girl, with her cryptic warnings and eerie calm, seemed to know things that he didn't, things he couldn't understand. Was she really trying to help him? Or was she just another part of the twisted web they had spun around him? Who are you? Charles demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. Why are you here? What do you want from me? The girl finally looked away from him, her gaze drifting to the door as if she were waiting for something. Or someone. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. And that was when Charles heard it. A sharp cracking noise. A door opening. And the footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the hallway. The game was about to change again. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, each step like a hammer on Charles's chest. He turned sharply, his pulse quickening, as the door at the far end of the room creaked open slowly. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, time itself pausing, holding its breath, waiting for what was about to enter. Bianca's face went pale, her eyes darting to the door, then quickly back to Jared. There was a flicker of panic in her gaze, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a controlled mask of indifference. She didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, as if she too was uncertain about what would happen next. Jared's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as the footsteps continued. He stepped closer to Bianca, blocking her from view, almost as if he were trying to shield her from whatever was coming through that door. The little girl, too, seemed to sense the shift in the air. Her tiny frame went still, but her eyes, those wide, knowing eyes, never left the door. Charles followed her gaze, his heart hammering in his chest as the door creaked open wider. And then he saw him. A tall, imposing figure stepped into the room, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face hidden by the shadows of the doorway, but there was no mistaking the presence he carried. This man wasn't just anyone. This man was someone Charles had only heard of in whispered conversations, a name that had been floated around in the undercurrents of the corporate world, someone powerful, someone who didn't need to announce his arrival to command attention. Mr. Whitaker, the man's voice cut through the silence, low and measured, almost predatory. It was a voice that seemed to make the air feel heavier, more oppressive. Charles could feel the tension in the room skyrocket. Bianca took a half step back, her breath barely audible. She didn't look at the man. Instead, she looked at Jared, then quickly glanced toward the little girl, who stood unmoving in the corner. "Who is that?" Charles asked, his voice tight, though his mind was already starting to connect the dots. He had seen this man before, though it hadn't been in person. His name had come up once or twice, in the context of corporate rivalries, shadow deals, and rumors of darker activities. But seeing him here, standing in his own home, in his own private dinner party, it felt like the walls were closing in on him. The man took another step forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. "The real question," he said, his lips curling slightly into a cold smile, "is who are you?" The chill in his voice made Charles's skin crawl. He had no idea how to respond. This was no ordinary man. This was someone who had orchestrated a plan so deep, so intricate, that Charles wasn't sure he could even begin to comprehend the full scope of it. The little girl didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her eyes never leaving the man, her tiny hands clenched at her sides. "You shouldn't have come," she said quietly, her voice firm. "You can't hide behind him anymore." The man's smile faded, but only for a fraction of a second. He looked at her, almost amused. "You think you know everything, don't you, little one?" His tone was mocking, but there was an edge to it that suggested he wasn't used to being challenged. Charles was torn. He was trying to piece together who this man was, why he was here, and how he was connected to the mess unfolding in front of him. Every instinct told him that something was terribly wrong, that this man had been pulling strings from the very beginning. But how deep did this go? Jared, still standing between Charles and the man, stiffened. He wasn't making a move, but it was clear that whatever this man represented, Jared was on his side. The power dynamic was shifting in ways Charles couldn't keep up with. He had always been the one in control, the one pulling the strings, but now he felt as though he were the pawn. The man looked at Bianca then, his expression unreadable. "You were supposed to keep him distracted. You were supposed to keep him away." Bianca's lips tightened, but she said nothing. She glanced at Charles, her eyes darkening with something he couldn't quite identify, something cold, calculating. But there was also something else there, guilt. Was she feeling remorse for the game she had been playing all along? Charles's mind raced, distracted, away. Had this been the plan all along? Had Bianca been working for this man? Was she part of this larger scheme, or had she been caught in something even bigger than herself? The man turned back to Charles, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, unsettling clarity. "You really have no idea, do you?" he asked, almost pityingly. "You've been so caught up in your little world, you didn't see the bigger picture. All of this, the money, the influence, the power, it's not yours to control. Not anymore." Charles swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" The man smiled again, but this time it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who knew they held all the cards, someone who had already won. "This was never about you, Mr. Whittaker. This was about what you could give us. You were just a stepping stone, a means to an end." The weight of his words settled on Charles's chest like a lead anchor. A means to an end. Had everything he worked for, all of his power, his wealth, been nothing more than a tool for someone else's agenda? Suddenly, the little girl stepped forward, her voice cutting through the thickening tension. "It's too late," she said, her voice calm but tinged with finality. "You don't understand. You never will." The room seemed to hold its breath again as she looked at the man, then back to Charles. "The poison has already been set in motion," she added. "The plan is in place. There's no stopping it now." Charles's mind reeled. The poison, the plan. Had she meant the drink? Or was she talking about something far more insidious? The deeper he dug, the more questions surfaced, and the more tangled everything seemed to become. Jared, who had been silent for the last few moments, finally spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "It's over, Whittaker. The game's finished." Charles's chest tightened as the room seemed to close in around him. The game's finished. But what did that mean? What did it mean for him? For his empire? For everything he had ever known? The man took another step forward, his eyes locking onto Charles with a look of finality. "You'll never see it coming, Mr. Whittaker. It's already too late." As the words hung in the air, Charles felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. He was no longer in control. He was no longer the player, he was the pawn. The footsteps outside the room seemed to grow louder, more urgent, and Charles couldn't help but feel that time was running out. The air in the room had thickened with the weight of the man's words, leaving Charles with a sinking feeling deep in his stomach. The tension was unbearable, as if the ground beneath him was shifting and the walls were closing in. But just as he thought he might understand the full scope of the conspiracy, just as he was about to confront the reality of his situation, a new sound broke the silence, one that immediately shifted the balance of power once more. A sudden sharp bang echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable screech of metal scraping against wood. The door to the living room flew open, and a tall figure appeared in the doorway. It wasn't the expected arrival of the other guests. No, this was something far more unexpected, far more dangerous. The man who entered the room was unlike anyone Charles had seen before. His presence was heavy, as if his very body carried the weight of something far darker than just his physical form. His eyes were cold, calculating, and there was a certain ferocity to the way he moved, as if he had been anticipating this moment for a long time. In one hand, he held a briefcase, the sleek black surface gleaming under the dim lights, but it wasn't the briefcase that caught Charles' attention. It was the gun pressed casually against his side. The newcomer scanned the room quickly, his gaze flicking over Bianca, then Jared, and finally landing on the man who had been speaking with such authority. The sharp silence that followed his arrival was palpable. It felt as if the world had just tilted sideways, throwing everything Charles thought he understood out of alignment. Without a word, the man with the gun moved forward. His steps were measured, deliberate, each one echoing like a countdown. Jared stiffened at the sight of him, his posture shifting as if preparing for something he couldn't control. Charles's pulse spiked. Who was this? He had no idea who this man was, but he could sense instantly that he was the wild card in the room, the unpredictable element that could upend everything. "Get down," the man said, his voice low, commanding yet eerily calm. It was directed at no one in particular, but everyone in the room seemed to feel the threat in his tone. The man with the briefcase placed it gently on the table, his eyes never leaving the others in the room. Bianca's face went white, her eyes flicking between the gunman and Jared, as though she was searching for an explanation. But there was no comfort coming from either of them. Jared's face had turned ashen, his lips tight with suppressed tension. "Is this the part where you say you've been working with me all along?" The man with the gun said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "No, Jared, this wasn't part of your plan. This is where everything goes off the rails." Charles could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The stakes were escalating faster than he could follow. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and he was starting to realize that he wasn't just caught in a power struggle. He was at the center of something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "Who the hell are you?" Charles managed to say, his voice tight, but his fear slowly transforming into something else, something colder. "What do you want?" The man with the gun glanced at Charles, but his eyes seemed to look through him, as though he were already dismissing him as irrelevant. "You're asking the wrong questions, Whittaker," he said coolly. "What you should be asking is why you weren't told the truth, why you were never meant to be in control." The words cut through the air like a knife. Charles's chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His mind raced, trying to process what the gunman had just said. Why wasn't he told the truth? What was he missing? How had he been manipulated, dragged into this game without even knowing the rules? The man with the gun turned to Bianca now, his gaze unrelenting. "This little charade is over," he said, his voice hardening. "You've played your part, but it's time to end it." Bianca's eyes widened, a flicker of panic flashing across her face. She stepped back, her hand instinctively moving toward the wine glass she had left on the table, but the man was faster. Before she could reach it, he grabbed her wrist with a grip so tight it made her wince. Charles was frozen. He had no idea who this man was, but he realized that he wasn't just some random player in this twisted game. This man knew things, had the power to tear down everything Charles had built with a single word. There was a familiarity to his presence. He wasn't just a stranger, but someone who had been operating in the shadows, pulling strings from the very beginning. "You think it's all about money, don't you?" the gunman said, turning to Charles now. His voice was ice cold, like he was speaking to someone beneath him. "You think it's all just business and power, but that's not the game you're in, Whittaker. The game you're in is about control, and you've never had it." Charles's mind was whirling. Control. What was he talking about? What was this man really after? Before he could react, the man turned back to Bianca. "You were always the one who was meant to hold the reins," he said, his voice now filled with venom. "You were always meant to be the one in charge. You just didn't realize it until now." Bianca's face paled even further, her lips trembling. For the first time, she looked truly vulnerable, as if the carefully constructed facade she had been hiding behind was cracking. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Don't say anything," the man with the gun snapped. "You've said enough already." Charles could feel the floor shifting beneath him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make sense. If Bianca was part of some larger scheme, what was her role? Was she playing him, or had she been a pawn too, manipulated by someone even more powerful than she was? And how did the little girl fit into all of this? What did she know that they didn't? The gunman's eyes shifted to the briefcase. He opened it slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. Inside, there were documents, papers, meticulously arranged, but it wasn't the papers that caught Charles' attention. It was the photograph lying on top, a photograph that sent a shock of recognition through him. He leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. And as he did, a sense of dread washed over him. The photo was of him, Charles Whittaker. But it wasn't just a regular photo. No, in the background, barely visible, were figures he recognized, people he had once trusted, people who had been in his inner circle. The pieces clicked together in a way that made Charles's stomach churn. The photograph wasn't just a picture, it was a warning. And suddenly, everything was clear. He had been the target all along. The tension in the room was unbearable. Charles's mind was racing, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place. Too late, it seemed. He had been played, manipulated from the very start. But why? And by whom? The photograph was damning. His eyes moved over it again, the faces in the background becoming clearer. Those familiar faces, trusted faces, were part of something far darker than he had imagined. They weren't just part of his empire, they were the architects of his downfall. The man with the gun noticed Charles's reaction. He smiled, a cold, almost victorious expression, like a predator watching its prey finally realize it's trapped. "You see it now, don't you?" he said. "You've been a tool, a puppet, and now the strings have been cut." Charles's throat was dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words got caught in his chest. The woman he loved, the one he thought was on his side, Bianca, had been working with this man all along. Jared, too. They had all been playing a much bigger game, a game he hadn't even known existed. His wealth, his influence, his empire, none of it mattered. He had been the distraction, the bait, while they played for something far more valuable than money. He looked at Bianca, her eyes full of regret now, but it wasn't the regret of someone who had been forced into this. It was the regret of someone who knew what was coming, someone who had made a choice long ago. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, but her voice remained silent. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally, so quietly it barely reached his ears. "Sorry," Charles echoed, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "Is that supposed to make up for all of this? For everything you've done?" Bianca's eyes flickered toward the gunman, who was now moving toward the briefcase again. "It was never about you, Charles," she said softly, almost apologetically. "You were never the endgame. You were just the start." Charles felt the anger flood through him. The start. He had given everything for her, for them. And this was how it ended, as a pawn in a game he couldn't even understand. His heart raced as he turned to the man with the gun, his voice trembling with fury. "What do you want from me? What's the endgame?" The man with the gun didn't answer immediately. He took a moment, as if savoring the final moments of Charles's realization. Power, influence, control over the very system you've spent your life building. But not for us. For someone much higher than you. You've never even seen the people pulling the strings behind all of this. Charles stared at him, his stomach turning. It wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about dismantling everything he had ever worked for. It was about taking down the empire from the inside out and using him as the unwitting tool to do it. The man stepped closer, his voice low and almost soothing. "You were a part of something much bigger, Whittaker, but you were never meant to know just how big." Then, without warning, the room seemed to shift again. A loud crash interrupted the moment, followed by shouts and heavy footsteps. The door to the living room flew open with a force that rattled the walls. Charles barely had time to react before a second figure entered, followed by more people. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces covered, weapons raised. For a moment, it was like a standoff. The room filled with the sounds of boots on the floor, the tension thick enough to suffocate. The gunman froze, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Who the hell are they?" the man growled, his gun instinctively shifting to target the newcomers. But they didn't respond with words. One of the figures stepped forward, raising a hand as if signaling to the others to hold their position. Then the figure pulled off his mask, and Charles's heart stopped. It was Jared. But this wasn't the same Jared Charles had known. The man before him now exuded a confidence that was almost terrifying. His eyes were sharp, cold, and filled with purpose. He wasn't some corporate lackey anymore. He wasn't someone taking orders. Jared was leading this new group, the real force behind it all. "Jared," Charles whispered, his voice barely audible. "What's going on? Who are they?" Jared turned his eyes to Charles. A flicker of something, was it regret, passing through his features, but he quickly masked it with a hard, unflinching look. "It's too late, Whittaker," he said, his voice firm. "This was always bigger than you, bigger than us." Charles felt his mind racing as he tried to grasp what was happening. He was surrounded on all sides by enemies, by people who had been orchestrating this whole scheme, and now Jared was a part of it too. The realization hit him like a wave, suffocating him. But then something unexpected happened. The little girl, the one who had been silent up until now, stepped forward again. Her eyes were wide, determined, but there was something new in them, something that Charles hadn't seen before. She didn't seem afraid anymore. "Enough," she said, her voice stronger this time, like she had just found her voice. The words rang in the air, and everyone turned toward her, confused. "Enough," the man with the gun echoed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Who are you to say enough?" The girl didn't flinch. She looked directly at him, her eyes burning with something that Charles couldn't quite understand. "You think you control everything. You think you've planned it all. But you're wrong. You're not the ones in control." The room went dead silent. Jared and the gunman exchanged a look, something in their faces shifting. But they didn't speak. The air seemed to hang heavy with anticipation, as if the very world were waiting for something. "She's the one," the girl said, her voice a little more forceful now. "The one you've all been hiding from. You think you're the masters of the game, but you've been playing into her hands the whole time." A collective gasp filled the room. The air seemed to freeze as Charles struggled to process what he was hearing. The girl wasn't just a witness to this game. She wasn't just a pawn. She was the player. And the realization hit him harder than anything else. The real mastermind had been someone else all along. The gunman's face went pale, his hand twitching slightly as he realized the truth in her words. He opened his mouth to speak, but the girl raised her hand, cutting him off. "She's been watching you all along. The woman you think you've controlled, she's the one who set this entire plan in motion. She's the one you've all been working for." Charles turned to look at Bianca. Her face went deathly white, and for the first time, her facade cracked completely. The guilt in her eyes was clear now. She had known all along. She had been playing her part, but not for them, not for Jared or the gunman, but for someone else, someone more powerful than all of them combined. And just as everything seemed to collapse around him, just as he thought he had nothing left to stand on, the final piece fell into place. The photograph. The moment he realized the real game was about power, real power had been leading to this. But who was she? Before he could ask, a loud, unmistakable voice rang out from behind him. "Enough," it said, and everything went still. And in that instant, he knew everything was about to change. The doors flew open, revealing the true mastermind. A figure who had been orchestrating every move from the shadows. And it wasn't who anyone expected. It was someone Charles had trusted more than anyone else. It was his own brother. The doors swung open with a heavy thud, and all eyes snapped toward the figure standing in the doorway. Charles froze. His heart slammed against his chest as his mind struggled to process what was happening. There, standing in the threshold, was a man he hadn't seen in years. His brother, David Whittaker. Charles's mouth went dry as he stared at him, the familiar face now twisted in a way he never could have imagined. David looked older, harder, his sharp eyes cold and calculating. He stepped into the room with an air of calm authority, his presence filling the space like a storm ready to break. "David," Charles breathed, almost disbelieving. "What are you doing here?" David smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a man who had any love for his brother. It was the smile of someone who had already won. "I thought it was about time you figured it out," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. After all, this was all part of the plan. You just couldn't see it. The weight of his words settled over Charles like a heavy blanket, suffocating him. David had been behind all of this, the betrayal, the manipulation, the game that had been played at his expense. It was all him. Charles shook his head in disbelief. "But why? Why would you do this? We were brothers. We built this empire together." David's gaze hardened. "That's the problem, Charles. Together wasn't enough. I was always in your shadow, always second place to you. And that's where I stayed, even after I helped you build this empire." His voice grew colder with every word. "But I realized something. The real power doesn't lie in wealth or influence. It lies in control. And I was done being a spectator." Charles felt a knot tighten in his stomach. All these years he had trusted David. He had seen him as an ally, a partner. But David had been playing him, using him as a stepping stone for his own ambitions. "You knew about Bianca," Charles said, his voice trembling. "You were the one behind everything, weren't you? You orchestrated it all." David didn't flinch. "Of course I did. You think Bianca was the mastermind?" "No, she was a tool. As were you. You were always the perfect pawn. It was easy to use you, Charles. You were so busy building your empire, you never noticed the cracks in the foundation." Charles's mind raced as the realization hit him. Bianca, Jared, even a little girl, it had all been part of a carefully constructed plan, a plan that had been set in motion long before Charles had ever known. His empire, his wealth, his position of power, they had all been tools in David's grand design. "But why the others?" Charles asked, his voice cracking. "Jared, Bianca, even that little girl. What were they all involved for?" David's lips curled into a sleek grin. Jared, of course, was always ambitious, always ready to do what was necessary to climb the ladder. Bianca, well, she was a little more complicated. She thought she had power. She thought she was playing the game, but in reality, she was just another piece I moved on the board. Charles turned to Bianca, his eyes full of hurt and confusion. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Bianca looked away, her face pale with guilt. "I didn't have a choice, Charles. I thought I could change things. I never wanted to hurt you." David chuckled darkly. "You didn't need to change anything. You just needed to stay in line. All of you did, and now here we are." Charles's mind was spinning, each revelation more painful than the last. His own brother had been behind it all, and now it felt like everything he had built was crumbling to dust. His trust, his relationships, his empire, everything was falling apart, and the worst part, he had never seen it coming. The gunman, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his hand resting on the briefcase on the table. "So now what, David?" he asked, his tone flat, as if the power dynamic had shifted entirely. "You've won. What's next?" David didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the others in the room, then back at Charles. There was a brief pause before he spoke again, his voice colder than ever. "Next," he said slowly, "is taking the empire I deserve. It was never about the money or the power. It was about control. And now that I have it, everything else will fall into place." Charles's stomach churned. This wasn't just a business takeover, it was personal. It was about years of resentment, of jealousy, of being overshadowed by his older brother. It was a desire to crush everything Charles had ever worked for, just so David could claim it as his own. "You're insane," Charles spat, his anger rising. "You can't just take everything. You think you can control everything, but you're wrong. You're not untouchable." David's smile grew wider, his eyes glinting with cold amusement. "I've always been untouchable, Charles. You just never knew it." Suddenly, the little girl stepped forward, her eyes narrowed as she looked at David. "You're not untouchable," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And you're not in control anymore." David paused, his eyes flicking to the girl in confusion. "And who are you to tell me what I can and can't control?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, something Charles hadn't noticed before. It was a simple thing, almost inconspicuous. She pressed a button, and the room was immediately flooded with a loud, screeching noise, like 1,000 alarms going off at once. David's face went white with shock. "What the hell is that?" "Backup," the girl said simply. "Backup that you didn't plan for." The sound grew louder, and suddenly, the house seemed to shake, as if the very foundation of it was starting to collapse. Charles had no idea what was happening, but it didn't matter. He watched as David's face contorted in panic, as the realization hit him that he had underestimated her, the one person he hadn't accounted for. Before David could react, the door behind him burst open, and several men in black tactical gear rushed in, guns drawn. They moved swiftly, surrounding David and the gunman, securing them both with precision. Charles's mind struggled to keep up with the sudden turn of events, but one thing was clear: David was no longer in control. As the men moved in to arrest David and the gunman, Charles's heart thudded in his chest, but it wasn't just from the adrenaline, it was the relief. The years of deceit, the betrayals, the manipulation, it was all finally coming to an end. Bianca stood silently, her face a mixture of regret and fear, while Jared looked as if he were trying to process everything happening around him. The girl, the one who had set it all in motion, stood calmly, watching the unfolding chaos with an expression of quiet satisfaction. As the authorities took David and the gunman into custody, Charles felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't the peace of victory, but the peace of knowing that the truth had finally come to light. David had been playing a game he couldn't control, and in the end, it had cost him everything. As the last of the armed men led David out of the room, Charles looked at the little girl, his mind still reeling from everything that had just transpired. Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. The girl smiled gently, her eyes softening. "I'm the one who saw through the lies. I'm the one who knew what was really going on." She paused for a moment, then added, "I'm just the one who helped you find the truth." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Charles with nothing but the silence that followed. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. But as the echoes of the chaos died down, one thing remained clear in his mind. It wasn't just about power anymore, it was about trust. And in the end, trust was the one thing he had almost lost. As the room began to empty, Charles knew that everything had changed. His empire, his relationships, his life, nothing would ever be the same again. But somehow, deep down, he realized that maybe that was for the best. The game was over, and he had finally won, not through power, but through the truth.